Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsey Lastinger, and myself, as well as my colleague Karen Jones, will be talking with you this morning about analyzing LabID event data in NHSN. So today we are going to introduce the analytic reports available for LabID event data. This includes MRSA bacteremia, C. difficile, as well as the other organisms in the MDRO module. We will discuss benchmarks such as rates and standardized infection ratios that you can use to track LabID events in your facility. I will then describe the risk adjustment used in the calculation of the LabID event SIRs for acute care hospitals. And at that point, Karen will come up and talk with you about which LabID events contribute to the SIR numerator that eventually is sent to CMS. And then she will also discuss techniques for ensuring accuracy and quality of your data. We will be using a few acronyms in the presentation today. They're listed here at the bottom of the slide, such as CO for Community-onset and COHICFA for Community-onset Healthcare Facility Associated. But I'm sure you're all familiar with those already since we're right after Denise's presentation. Okay, so let's get started with LabID analysis reports in NHSN. So the first thing you will see when you go to the analysis portion of NHSN is a list of folders that contain the analytic reports for each module. So today we're going to open the LabID event reporting folder, and you will then see several subfolders, one for each organism in the module. So of course we have our two main organisms that get most of the attention around here. That's MRSA and C. difficile. But we do have several other organisms available for surveillance. And I want to point out the CRE reporting folders. So there is one folder for all CRE LabID events. That means all species combined. And there are also separate analysis reports for each of the three individual species that make up our CRE definition, which is Klebsiella, E. coli, and Enterobacter. This table will tell you the number of facilities that are doing surveillance in NHSN for each organism in the MDRO module. Aside from MRSA and C. difficile, you can see that CRE is the most commonly followed organism that is not required by CMS. The surveillance of these organisms is mainly driven by state or local reporting mandates, or in which hospitals may voluntarily choose to do surveillance on these. Okay, so line lists and frequency tables. This is a great place to start your analysis, especially if you're new to NHSN. The line list will give you event level details for all of your LabID events that are entered. And the frequency table will give you counts of events that meet different types of criteria. You can use these reports to see how NHSN has categorized each of your LabID events using either the onset variable or the CDI assay variable. You can also use the line list and the frequency table to determine which events and how many events are being counted in the SIR. These reports are also very easy to customize. I'm sure some of you are familiar with our modification screen. You can add or remove variables of interest. You can also set a custom time period, either monthly, quarterly, half year, or for an entire year that you can run these reports for. Okay, so moving on to the rate tables. You can use the rate tables to answer the question, how often are LabID events occurring in my facility? NHSN provides healthcare onset and community onset rates for each organism in the module. And rates will be available for the locations that are listed separately on your monthly reporting plan. So that means those are the locations you are entering location-specific denominator records for. So for most facilities, this means you can get a rate for FAC-wide in, which would be a single rate for the entire facility, as well as your emergency departments, 24-hour observation units, and your CMS certified rehab units. So those are the units that are required for surveillance for CMS. So those are most commonly what you'll see when you run your rate tables. However, if you do want to see rates for other particular units in your facility, we recommend you add those units to your monthly reporting plans and begin reporting that unit-specific denominator record. The rate tables are very useful for data quality checks. They will display the number of events, the number of patient days, and the number of admissions. And again, these can be generated monthly, quarterly, half year, or for an entire year. Okay, so moving to the healthcare onset incidence rate. This is used to describe the amount or the frequency of healthcare onset events that are being identified in inpatient locations in your facility. For C. difficile, we define this rate as the number of incident healthcare onset CDI events divided by the number of patient days and multiplied by 10,000. So 10,000 is the number that we call the multiplier, and that is something we use just to help us interpret the rate. So we would be able to say that this rate for CDI is per 10,000 patient days. The numerator of the incidence rate is exactly the same as the numerator of the SIR. It includes all the same deduplication algorithms, and I have the variable name up there on the slide. So looking at this example here, we have a monthly incidence rate for October, November, and December. And if we focus in just on October's data, we can see this facility identified one healthcare onset CDI event, and they reported 1,200 patient days. So this gives us a rate of 8.3. And we would interpret this rate saying that our facility saw 8.3 incident healthcare onset CDI events per 10,000 patient days. Okay, so moving on to the community onset prevalence rate. NHSN provides two types of community onset prevalence rates. One is an inpatient prevalence rate, which is defined as the number of inpatient community onset events divided by the number of admissions and multiplied by 100. And then we have an outpatient community onset prevalence rate. This will be used mostly for your EDs and your 24-hour observation units, and that rate uses the number of encounters as the denominator. So in this example here, we're looking at the inpatient community onset prevalence rate. And again, we see a monthly rate for the last quarter of 2018. And if we look at October data, we can see the facility reported one community onset inpatient event, and they had 804 admissions, which gives us a rate of 0.124 per 100 admissions. So that number is a little hard to interpret. It's a little hard if you're going to explain this or present this rate to others in your facility. So there's a very easy way to change this, and that is to change the multiplier that we use in the formula. So NHSN will always use 100 for the community onset prevalence rate multipliers, but you can change this to a higher number, which will help you interpret these small rates. And the way you do that is you pull these numbers out of NHSN and you calculate this rate manually outside of the application. So if we were to change that 100 to 1,000, we then would interpret the rate as 1.24 inpatient community onset CDI events per 1,000 admissions. Those two rates are equivalent. It's just another way to describe it that is a little bit easier to understand. Even though NHSN will calculate rates for you for your facility, national LabID rates are not available for any organism. There are a few reasons for this. For MRSA bacteremia and CDI, we have a national benchmark in the form of the standardized infection ratio, which offers a better comparison of your data to the national data because it takes into account significant predictors of infection. Now, for the other organisms in the module, we saw earlier that reporting is variable for those organisms. CDC will continue to evaluate the amount of these data entered into NHSN, and national benchmarks may be available in the future if sufficient data exists. If you are working in a state that has a reporting mandate for one of these organisms, I do recommend you reach out to your state or local health department to see if they perhaps are publishing a state benchmark that you could use for tracking. Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about the standardized infection ratio. So it's Wednesday. I know we've been here for 2 days. You're all experts, I'm sure, on the SIR. But just in case, I'm going to do a quick little review. So this SIR, you can use it to answer the question, how does MRSA or CDI in my facility compare to the nation? The SIR is calculated as the number of observed healthcare onset events divided by the number of predicted healthcare onset events. The number of observed events, Karen is going to talk more about this in her half of the presentation, but it is the healthcare onset events that are entered into NHSN and that meet the SIR inclusion criteria. The number of predicted events is calculated for you by NHSN, and it is based on the national 2015 baseline data. It is calculated specifically for your facility based on the characteristics that you have reported for your hospital. Okay, and the way we interpret the SIR is in the green box here on the slide. If the SIR is greater than 1, that means the facility observed more events than were predicted by the baseline. And if the SIR is less than 1, that means the facility observed fewer events than what was predicted by the baseline. We also use p-values and 95% confidence intervals to help us interpret the statistical significance of the SIR. Okay, so let's look at an example of an MRSA SIR report from NHSN. So we will go through each column of the report. And first, let's look at the top row. So that's 2018 Q3 data. We see that the facility reported 3 months of data for the quarter. The SIR numerator is called MRSA_blood incident count. That's the column right next to the months column. In this example, they reported 1 event. The SIR denominator, the number predicted, in the column it's called numpred. And in this case, the number predicted is 1.314. The facility reported 17,089 patient days, and this gives us an SIR of 0.761. Okay, so how would we interpret this SIR? Because that SIR is less than 1, we can say that the facility observed fewer MRSA blood events than what was predicted by the national baseline. Okay. Continuing on the far right-hand side of the table, we find the p-value and the 95% confidence interval. So in this example, the p-value is 0.89, and that is greater than 0.05. And we also see that the 95% confidence interval includes the value of 1. So what does this mean? We can say our SIR is not statistically significant. In other words, the number of observed events is not significantly different than the number predicted. Okay, so let's look now at the second row on the table. That's 2018 Q4. Again, the facility reported 3 months of data and 2,627 patient days. The facility observed 3 healthcare onset MRSA blood events. However, if we look at the right-hand side of the table, we see that the SIR, the p-value, and the confidence interval are all missing. So this brings us to our first knowledge check. So you can get your phone or your laptop ready. True or false, the SIR and statistics are not calculated in this example because the number of patient days for this quarter is below the predetermined threshold. So A is true, B is false. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple more seconds. Okay, so it seems like we have a little bit of a mix here. Correct answer is B, false. Okay, let's look at our rationale. Okay, NHSN does not calculate SIRs when the number of predicted events is less than 1. And this rule is instituted across all of the HAI types, and it is regardless of the number of patient days that are reported. Okay, When the number of predicted events is less than 1, we tend to have statistically imprecise SIRs, which have extremely high values and are difficult to interpret. Okay, when we look at this SIR report as a whole, looking at both quarter 3 and quarter 4 data, we may notice that the number predicted has changed pretty drastically between those 2 quarters. If you notice this happening in your facility, it might warrant some additional investigations into your data to make sure that your risk adjustment calculations and those variables were entered accurately for both quarters. And one way to really investigate this is to understand the variables that go into the calculation of the number predicted. So that way you can see where something might have been entered incorrectly. Okay, so that's the topic of the next few slides. We're going to talk about those variables used for the number predicted events. I will focus on MRSA bacteremia, but several of these variables are also used for C. difficile. So the number of predicted MRSA events are calculated using a negative binomial regression model, which identified 6 different factors that contribute to that number predicted, as well as the total patient days. You can find these 6 factors in the data tables of your SIR report directly in NHSN. If you scroll to the bottom of your SIR report, you will see a table similar to the one on the slide, which is called the Risk Adjustment Factors Table. This will show you everything that NHSN is using to calculate that number of predicted events. We do recommend that you review this report every time you run your SIR so that you become comfortable and familiar with your risk factors. So let's take a closer look at this first variable. Okay, this is the inpatient MRSA community-onset prevalence rate. And when you see this rate, you want to ask yourself if this rate is correct or consistent to the prevalence rates you're used to seeing for your facility. If the prevalence rate looks like it might be wrong or something looks a little off, we recommend you confirm your community onset events and your number of admissions and ensure they were entered correctly. So your community onset events can be reviewed using the MRSA line list, and your total admission counts can be reviewed on the FACWIDE and denominator screen. So let's take a look at this FACWIDE and denominator screen. The MRSA prevalence rate uses the number of admissions from line 2 as the denominator. So it's very important that you are entering data correctly on the FACWIDE and denominator screen on all 3 lines of data entry. Just a few more points about this prevalence rate. It includes data only from inpatient locations and is only capturing the community onset events. There is a 14-day deduplication applied to the prevalence rate, meaning if you had a patient with 2 community onset events within 14 days, that second event will not be counted in this prevalence rate. The rate is calculated for the entire quarter, and that means the quarterly community onset prevalence rate is used to predict the quarterly number of healthcare onset MRSA events. You can view this rate in the MRSA rate tables. I have the variable names up on the slide. You can also use an indicator variable on the MRSA line list, which will tell you exactly which events contribute to the prevalence rate. Okay, our next risk adjustment variable is the outpatient prevalence rate. This rate will combine data from your emergency departments and your 24-hour observation locations into a single rate used for risk adjustment. Again, this rate is calculated for the entire quarter because that is what the model found to be the best predictor of MRSA bacteremia. This combined prevalence rate is available in the NHSN rate tables. And if you do not have an ED or a 24-hour observation location, that's okay. You will still receive risk adjustment based on the other variables in the model. But if you do have those units, it's extremely important that you confirm they are listed on your monthly reporting plan and they are mapped for your facility. Okay, I want to pause for just a few seconds, give everyone a chance to reflect on what we just learned from those 2 prevalence rates. Okay, so the LabID event SIRs are a quarterly measure. So we saw for both of those prevalence rates, they are calculated at a quarterly level. This means the SIRs can only be calculated once those prevalence rates are available at the end of the quarter. In addition, the CDI SIRs are risk adjusted for the CDI test type, which is only collected once per quarter. Therefore, if you try to run your SIRs before the quarter is complete, as maybe some of you have, you will not see the results that you're expecting. Okay, in most cases, you will not get any table in your output. So we strongly recommend you wait until the quarter is finished. You finish all your data entry for all 3 months, and then you can look at your MRSA and CDI SIRs for that quarter. Okay, so back to our risk adjustment factors table. Our next variables, we have 4 different values that are taken from the annual survey or from NHSN enrollment data. So the SIR looks at the average length of stay, your medical school affiliation, your type of facility, and the number of ICU beds. In addition, the last variable is the number of patient days. Okay, so patient days are collected on the FACWIDE and denominator form, and they are summed for the quarter, and then that variable is used for risk adjustment. So let's go back to our favorite data entry screen, FACWIDE and denominator. The MRSA SIR is based on the patient days you enter on line number 2. The C. difficile SIR is based on the patient days from line number 3. So again, it is really important that you understand the different exclusions on each of these 3 lines and that you are entering the denominators correctly. Karen will talk more about this and some data quality issues that we've been seeing later in the presentation. Okay, so it's now time for our second knowledge check. There are 4 different sentences on this slide about LabID event SIRs, and it's up to you to decide which one is true. Okay, so A, SIRs are available for all organisms in the MDRO module. B, I can review my facility's MRSA SIRs for each month of a quarter. C, if a facility adds their medical ICU to their monthly reporting plan, a LabID event SIR will become available for that ICU. Or D, the MRSA SIR is risk adjusted using the inpatient and outpatient community-onset prevalence rates. Okay, I'll give you just a few more seconds. All right, great. So it looks like most of you are selecting D, which is the correct answer. Okay, so I won't read through all of the rationales on this slide, but I will point out option C was incorrect. That's because SIRs are only available for FACWIDE-in or CMS certified rehab units. Even if they add a medical ICU to their reporting plan, they will not be able to get an SIR, but they would be able to see a rate for that ICU. Okay, and finally, so my last topic, we're going to talk about CDI test type and risk adjustment. So the CDI SIR is risk adjusted for each quarter based on the category. So when you select your CDI test type, NHSN is placing your facility into one of the 3 categories on the slide, either the NAT category, the EIA category, or the other category. And it's based on that test method or the final test method that's used in an algorithm. Okay, if we look at the second column in this table, we have the parameter estimates. These are numbers that are taken from the risk adjustment model, and they describe how that category contributes to the number of predicted events. So if the parameter estimate is referent, as we see in the other category, this means there's no contribution to the number of predicted events. You get no type of risk adjustment if your CDI test type falls into that other category. If the parameter estimate is positive, this will contribute to more predicted events. And if the parameter estimate is negative, this contributes to fewer predicted events. So a common question we receive from facilities involves facilities that are changing CDI test methods, and they want to know how that change impacts their SIR. So in this example, the facility is changing from NAT in quarter 1 to a 2-step algorithm of NAT plus EIA in quarter 2. How will this change impact their number of predicted events? Okay, so let's see how we will answer this. The CDI test type category, in this case, is moving from the NAT category to the EIA category. Okay, and if we look at the parameter estimates, we can see that the EIA category contributes to fewer predicted events. So that parameter estimate is negative, especially compared to what this facility was receiving under the NAT category when they had a positive parameter estimate. However, nothing is that straightforward. And in this case, the number of predicted CDI events is calculated using 8 different variables. So a change to your number of predicted events will depend on a change to any of those 8 variables. Okay, this especially means your quarterly patient days and your quarterly prevalence rate, which we know will change every quarter. In addition, a change in CDI test type may impact a change in the community onset prevalence rate because your facility will now be identifying more or fewer CDI events that go into the prevalence rate. So our final answer is that the change in the number of predicted events cannot be determined by assuming that CDI test type is the only variable that is changing for your facility between 2 quarters. Okay, but for this example, if we want to assume that all variables in the model are going to stay the same except for CDI test type, then in this example, the facility may see a decrease in their number of predicted events because EIA is their new category, which has that negative parameter estimate. Okay, I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Karen for part 2 of the presentation.
Thank you. Okay, so I will be discussing the SIR numerator and the number of observed LabID events. But before we go there, I want to discuss 3 important LabID analysis variables. That would be CDI test type, onset, and CDI assay. So a little more about CDI test type that was previously discussed. So CDI test type is entered on the fact-widened monthly denominator form on the 3rd month of each quarter, March, June, September, and December. The CDI test type method is available within the drop-down menu, and these are the available options that you will find within NHSN. But just to, and in this drop-down, you will find a mix of single-step and multi-step testing algorithms. So the options displayed on the screen, again, are the testing methods, whereas the options that Lindsey previously presented are the risk adjustment categories. And so you're going from the CDI test type methods, and when we're talking about specifically the SIR models, we're talking about the CDI test type risk adjustment. So onset, you guys have already been exposed to this, so I would just reinforce that onset uses the location, facility admission date if applicable, and the specimen collection date. And again, onset is assigned within the NHSN application. And the categories are, classifications are community onset, co-HICFA, and also healthcare facility onset. A little bit more about onset is that community onset and co-HICFA events are not included in the SIR numerator, and I will be discussing that a bit more. And co-HICFA events are not counted in the community onset admission prevalence rate. And so on the screen is a screenshot of a line list for MRSA line list where you can see onset, and we pulled in a couple of other variables that might be helpful when you're reviewing an MRSA line list. So CDI assay is again uses the current and prior specimen collection date in its categorizations, and it is assigned within the NHSN application. The categories are incident, recurrent, and blank. So you guys have already had the definition for incident and recurrent, but I would like to talk a little bit about blank. So when you review your line list, you might see something blank or you think it's missing. It is not an error. It is a classification category where blank represents when a positive specimen was collected within less than 2 weeks earlier. And so when you see CDI-assay is blank, it represents a duplicate event in a new location. So both blank and recurrent events are not counted in the SIR numerator, and I promise I will tell you what's in the numerator, just one more piece. And so this is also just a sample line list of CDI, where you can see the onset and CDI classification there. And again, when you're working with your line list, feel free to pull in as many variables as you need. These are just some of the suggestions, some of the go-to variables that I pull in when I'm looking at line lists. Okay, so why are we here? So one of the common questions we receive from NHSN users is regarding which events are actually included in the SIR. So the question could be, I entered 5 MRSA events for 2009 quarter 1, but only 4 events are included in the SIR numerator. So why is the SIR excluding some of my events? Well, just as a reminder, all LabID events that meet NHSN protocol must be reported to NHSN. Events that are not counted in the SIR numerator actually contribute to the risk adjustment and algorithms to determine if there are duplicate events. However, not all LabID events are included in the SIR numerator. So, specifically, which events are included in the fact-wide-in SIR numerator? So for CDI, that includes those that are in inpatient units only, excluding rehab and psych units, those that are healthcare onset, and those that are incident. For MRSA bacteremia, that includes those blood specimens from inpatient locations that exclude rehab and psych units, those that are healthcare onset, and when there are no positive MRSA bacteremia in the previous 14 days in any location. Oh, and just as a reminder, for more information about what's included in the SIR numerator, I would reference the link here, but you guys also have a copy of it in your resources document. So, another common question is that our patient was positive for MRSA on day 1, and a second positive specimen was collected on day 6 in a different location, in a different unit. The second specimen is labeled HO in NHSN. How do I change this? Well, the answer is you cannot change the onset categorization as applied by NHSN. But let's use this scenario for a quick knowledge check. Same scenario. A patient was positive for MRSA on day 1. A second positive specimen was collected on day 6. And so this specimen is classified as HO. So true or false, the second specimen is counted in the MRSA SIR numerator. So text A if the answer is true, and B if the answer is false. Okay. So the correct answer is false. So the second specimen is not counted in the MRSA SIR numerator. That second specimen is correctly labeled as healthcare onset, but there was a positive MRSA bacteremia in the previous 14 days in another location. So just as a reminder, not all HO events are counted in the SIR numerator. So to review the fact-wide-in, to review which events are included in your fact-wide-in numerator, you can run a LabID event line list for your organism of interest, and you can review the specific indicator variable. And so there is one for both CDI and MRSA, and those variables are in bold. So when you see a value of 1, it indicates that that event is counted in the SIR numerator, and a value of 0 indicates that it is not counted in the SIR numerator. And so in the blue box, that's the MRSA indicator But let's review. So let's just take MRSA as an example. So when you're reviewing your MRSA events, ask yourself these 3 questions. Did the event occur in an inpatient unit? Is the event labeled HO, or healthcare onset? And was there a prior MRSA positive event in the previous 14 days in any location? So taking those 3 questions, let's apply it to the line list that you have on the screen. So let's take the first event and go through these questions. So you can see that this event did occur in an inpatient location. The event is labeled HO, and if we assume that this particular event for this patient, or patient 303, that this is their first event, then we can say that there were no prior MRSA positive events in the previous 14 days in any location. So you can see for that particular for that particular event, the MRSA indicator variable has a value of 1, so this particular event is included in the SIR numerator. And if you are curious, I provided explanation as to why the events where the indicator is 0, why those events are not included in the SIR numerator. So if you want to determine which events are included in the SI numerator, I provided the MRSA and CDI numerator variables across all the facility types. Although we won't have time to discuss all of them, but same applies. A value of 1 indicates that that event is included in the SIR numerator, and a value of 0 indicates that it is not included. But one particular facility type that I wanted to discuss is the CMS certified inpatient rehabilitation unit, or IRF units, that are located within a hospital. As you see, that those particular indicator variables are slightly different. So these images all have something in common, and each pair has something in common. Yes, they're all food. And I know lunch is close, so I'm not trying to distract you or trick you by showing good-looking foods. But each of these pairs are different in some way. And so, as we mentioned, most of the presentation thus far has focused on the FACT-1 and SIR. And so I wanted to discuss some of the important differences between the FACT-1 and IRF SIRs. So hospitals with an IRF unit have 2 separate SIRs submitted. One, and again, this is if it's applicable to your facility. One is the FACT-1 SIR for the acute care hospital, and then the IRF unit-specific SIR. And so to view those CMS SIR reports, you can access them through the CMS report folders, as you see on the screen. And if this applies to your facility, we strongly encourage you to review both. As you may already be aware, as of 2018 Q4, MRSA is no longer part of the CMS IRF-QR program. So this means that your IRF CMS reports for MRSA will include only data through 2018 Q3. However, those SIRs are not going away. They will still be accessible in your non-CMS report folders, which you can access, which will be the folders that are above the CMS report folders. So which events are counted in the SIR numerator for the IRF unit? So for CDI, that includes specimens collected in CMS certified rehab units, specimens that are collected on day 4 or later after being transferred to the rehab unit, and when there was no positive test in the previous 14 days in any rehab unit within the facility. I have the events that are included for the SIR numerator for MRSA for your reference. As you will see, they're very similar to that of CDI. And just like with FACT-1, you can also run a line list to determine which events are included in your IRF SIR. And those variables are in bold on that last item. So another quick and final knowledge check just about what we've gone over. True or false? The algorithm for the SIR numerator is different for fact-wide N and IRF units. Text A if the answer is true, and B if the answer is false. Okay, so very good. The answer is true. We previously discussed it. I just have the headers for the slides, but we've discussed the fact-wide N SIR numerator and the IRF-specific SIR numerator. But again, a very nice, handy document where all this information is laid out. I love it. I recommend it. Again, it's the troubleshooting document for MRSA and CDI events. So the final section I will be discussing is data quality. So I wanted to point out a few data quality items that our team specifically investigates and we contact facilities about. And so we're hoping that some of these data quality checks help you all as you're preparing your data for quarterly review. But before I go there, I can never just jump into a topic. I have to add additional note. So my colleagues have previously mentioned this, but we do encourage facilities to regenerate their data sets often, particularly if you're about to look into data quality. I would definitely recommend that. So a little bit more about CDI test type. So in particular, we look at data where CDI test type is reported as other. So other is a valid option within the NHSN dropdown. And however, we believe that the majority of hospitals may not need to select other. Instead, there may be a more appropriate testing method from the pre-populated list. So in our experience while reviewing this other specified field, we've identified that there were responses that actually corresponded to values within the drop-down menu. One in note is that facilities using PCR testing should indicate so by selecting NAT from the drop-down. However, we do acknowledge that in rare cases, other is a valid CDI test type method to report. We focus on this one in particular because it does have a possible impact to the SIR. So the CDI test type risk adjustment categories I have on the screen here, and that's the one that Lindsey previously presented. Just want to go through a scenario about sort of like how the data can be reported and how it would affect the SIR. So let's assume a facility reports other from the drop-down list, but they specify PCR in the actual other specified field. This will cause your facility's SIR to be inflated. So I've applied fictitious data, and the only thing I'm going to change between these two examples are the CDI test type risk adjustment. So again, PCR, instead of selecting other, PCR should be selected specifically. So applying fictitious data, let's say our SIR calculated with our risk adjustment of other would be 1.299. But instead, if a facility selects NAT instead, the facility's SIR will receive the proper risk adjustment category and calculated appropriately. So let's take those exact same risk adjustments that I used to determine the first SIR. If we changed the risk adjustment category appropriately to NAT, the SIR for this particular scenario, all fictitious data, the SIR would result in 1.14. So to review your CDI test type, you can review each denominator form manually. And if you're within the application, a recent enhancement has been added. So facilities that select other from the drop-down list, upon saving, the application is going to bring up a soft alert and just provide more information about the CDI test type risk adjustment and ask you to confirm, but it gives you an opportunity to go back and adjust your response. So in addition to reviewing the denominator forms manually, it's available in an advanced report through the CDI test method history. And so this is a sample line list of that result if you use that report, where you will see the CDI test method for each month on the denominator forms, as well as it also pulls in the CDI test method reported on your annual surveys. So another data quality item that we look into is that of data reported on the fact-wide-in denominator form. And so I'm just going to go over this quickly because Denise already did a great job of explaining it all, where you see that the denominator data are collected across 3 lines of data, where line 1 indicates counts of all inpatient locations, line 2 would include inpatient locations except CMS certified rehab and psych, and line 3 would be all inpatient locations except CMS certified IRF and psych units, NICUs, and well baby units. So just in our experience, particularly with the older form, we identified, we identified some data quality issues reporting with line 2 and line 3, where it's sort of, this is an extreme number, but these are just some sort of like invokes something that seems suspicious. And so because of some of the data we've observed this way, we wanted to just make sure that line 2 and 3 refers to actual patient days and admissions for all locations and not actual incident counts. So for this particular data quality item, we do a data quality check. And so we sort of flag anything that looks suspicious. And so one of our outreach that we do is that we contact facilities that report patient days or admissions on line 2 or 3 that happens to be less than 25% of line 1. And so we reach out to facilities and just to sort of clarify and also just bring that to their attention. So a quick way to review your fact-wide-in denominator values is to review the summary data line list. And so in that line list on this screen, you will find the variable name that corresponds to the patient days and admissions on lines 1, 2, and 3. And so lastly, another data quality item is to ensure reporting for the quarter is complete. And to do so, you can review to ensure all monthly reporting plans have been completed, the event data have been completed, and the summary data have been completed. And also, I will review a few analysis options to review the data when the quarter is incomplete. So let's first check the monthly reporting plans. It is very important to ensure that your fact-wide-in, ED, and 24 observation units are included in your monthly reporting plan for all 3 months. And again, if the ED and OBS locations are applicable. As Denise previously mentioned, if an ED or a 24 observation unit was made active after the monthly reporting plan is completed, the application does not automatically add that. And so it's very important to update the monthly reporting plans if needed. A quick way to review your monthly reporting plans is through an advanced analysis folder where you see the plan data. And so when you use that report, you will be able to see each unique row that corresponds to a very specific location and month pair. And so that way you can review for the entire year a really very helpful way. And so just in this screenshot, I've just included your MRSA and your CDI variables and the location. Another important piece is to ensure your fact-wide-in, ED, and 24 observation unit denominator data are complete for all 3 months. To review your denominator data, you can go to another advanced report. And a quick way to review just your MDRO and CDI is that you can apply a filter to summary type. I'm just indicated as MDRO. And also this is where you can, again, review your fact-wide-in denominator values. And so in this screenshot, this is just a sample of your line list, but feel free to pull in any additional facility identifiers and any additional display variables that will make this line list work best for your facility. Another way to review incomplete months is that you can use your SIR report for CDI events. So when you view your SIR report, the very first table is just going to be the SIR data. But if you scroll down, if for whatever reason there are months that are being excluded for the SIR, you will see that in the bottom. So this, for CDI, you will see months of data included here if the CDI test type was blank. And so for this example, we have January and February included here. Well, that's because CDI test type is blank. CDI test type is not reported until March. And so that's why you will see these 2 months of data here. However, once March event has been completed and the corresponding denominator form has been completed, you will then see your all of your 2019 quarter 3 data rolled into your SIR. And so lastly, just some few ways to review your LabID data before the quarter is complete. As Lindsey previously mentioned, monthly SIRs are not possible. However, there are still some helpful analysis reports that you can use. And so one way is that you can use your SIR reports to review your monthly counts of events that would be included in your SIR numerator and those patient days. And on the bottom of the slide, you will see just an example of how that would look and how you'd be able to use the corresponding data. Another way to review monthly data is to look at your rate tables and look at the monthly healthcare onset and community onset rates. A third option is to review your frequency tables and observe the number of events reported for each unit. And lastly, you can review your summary data line list that will display patient days, admissions, and CDI test type. And so unfortunately, we do not have enough time to go through all of this information, but we've included several examples walking you through how to pull that monthly data in the appendix. Okay, so in conclusion, for our section, LabID rate tables are available on a monthly basis for all organisms in the MDRO module. LabID SIRs are available on a quarterly basis for MRSA and CDI and are risk adjustment using several variables. Not all events are included in the SIR numerator, and for that, for additional details on that, I will point you to to earlier in this presentation, as well as the MRSA and CDI troubleshooting document. And also just to remind you just about data quality, the importance of regenerating your data set, reviewing your fact-wide and denominator forms, considering the values reported for your CDI test method, and also ensuring that all 3 months of data have been completed. And lastly, we've included even more topics in the appendix for items that we were unable to get to. And so that concludes, not yet, that includes the LabID analysis section. And so Lindsey will be joining me back up for questions. And we do have time for a few questions.
All right, Lindsey and Karen, we had a couple questions from our users online. The first question is, we use an electronic surveillance system to identify LabID events. It has built-in exclusions that eliminate the duplicated patient results, so reports for those are not generated to upload to NHSN. Since events that are not counted in the SIR numerator contribute to risk adjustment, should we be adjusting the system so that these events, duplicates, are reported as well?
Yes, so that is a great question. As Karen mentioned, all LabID events that meet the protocol's definition need to be reported, not just the ones that are counted in the SIR, especially for purposes of risk adjustment. So if you are using a vendor or an electronic system You want to make sure that they are reporting all positive specimens that meet the definition and are not applying their own deduplication criteria or algorithms to only report those included in the SIR numerator.
Okay, one more. Does a C. diff LabID identified as CoHICFA and classified as incident count in FACWIDE-in SIR numerator?
Is it FACWIDE-in?
One more time.
Yes.
Does a C. diff LabID identified as CoHICFA and classified as incident count in FACWIDE-in SIR numerator?
Great question. No, CoHICFA events are not included in the SIR numerator. You guys should know, I clearly love that MRSA CDI troubleshooting document. But I'm hoping that document will be able to help really distinguish what's included and what's not included in the SI numerator.